What if I told you two astronauts spent nearly a year in space, risking their lives every single day, and only got paid $5 a day for it? No bonus, no extra pay, just silence. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to our channel. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support is the fuel that keeps us creating powerful, meaningful stories like this one. The morning sky over Cape Canaveral was clear, the kind of soft blue that looked like it had been freshly painted. A few streaks of cloud drifted over the ocean, and the breeze carried just enough salt to remind anyone standing on the tarmac that the sea was nearby. Always watching. Inside the crew prep building, the air smelled faintly of coffee and worn canvas. Astronaut Butch Wilmore sat in silence, tying his boots with deliberate movements. Across from him, Suni Williams checked her checklist one more time, even though she knew it by heart. Neither of them said much. There wasn't anything new to say. The mission was supposed to last 10 days. That's what the paperwork said. A standard orbital demonstration. Fly the Starliner, dock with the station, validate systems, and return home. Straightforward. Just another page in NASA's long logbook of controlled risk. Butch, a Navy pilot turned space veteran, had seen enough to know that straightforward rarely meant simple. He'd flown through unpredictable weather and once steered a damaged capsule back to Earth without half his navigation systems. He didn't complain back then, and he wasn't about to start now. Suni, with her dark hair tucked neatly into her flight cap, was calm in that way people only became after doing something difficult so often it stopped being terrifying. She'd spent more than a year of her life floating above the Earth. What unsettled others, she had learned to make routine. That morning, as they suited up, mission control buzzed with quiet efficiency. Engineers monitored screens. Techs made final adjustments. Everything felt polished, ready, yet beneath that surface was something heavier, almost invisible, like the last moment before a storm that no one sees coming. By noon, the Starliner lifted off, a thunderous roar that scattered the gulls and shook the pavement. In the viewing area, a few family members clapped. Some wiped away tears. Reporters scribbled notes they would later condense into 4-paragraph blurbs. In orbit, things started well. The capsule docked without issue. The crew integrated seamlessly, and daily reports went back to Houston like clockwork. For a while, it was quiet, just as expected. Then the problems began. At first, they were small. A sensor misfire, a software glitch that needed patching. But every delay seemed to uncover another. The Starliner's return was pushed from day 10 to day 13, then to day 21. Each time, ground control said the same thing, just a little longer. Eventually, they stopped giving dates. On the ISS, Butch and Suni adapted. They weren't scheduled crew, but they helped wherever they could, checking oxygen levels, assisting with experiments, repairing a faulty stabilizer that had been scheduled for replacement next quarter. They never asked for recognition. It wasn't their style, but even astronauts feel time differently when no one mentions the word home. By month 3, a rhythm settled in. Wake, exercise, work, sleep, repeat. Mission support sent up books, movies, small jokes embedded in data packets. It helped, but not enough to ignore the fact that their original mission timeline was long gone. Then came the discovery. It was Suni who noticed it first. Reading through an automated report attached to their federal payroll account. $5. Not per hour, not per task, per day. Butch checked his account too. Same number, same note, standard per diem for temporary mission assignment. Neither of them had been reclassified as long-term personnel, which meant their hazard allowances, overtime, and mission bonuses hadn't kicked in. They were, according to the system, on a temporary field trip. They didn't mention it to each other at first. It wasn't worth the space it would take up in their already packed minds. But it lingered. $5 a day. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about what that money meant. That number whispered something they didn't want to hear. What you're doing isn't as important as you thought. Nearly 10 months later, back on Earth, in a room full of reporters and flashing cameras, the topic finally surfaced. During a routine press briefing, a journalist raised their hand and looked directly at the president. "Mr. President," she asked, "are you aware that 2 American astronauts have been living aboard the ISS for nearly a year, and are receiving only $5 a day in federal support?" The room shifted. You could hear chairs creak. See pens pause mid-sentence. Donald Trump looked up, his eyes narrowed, not in disbelief, but in something closer to irritation. He repeated the number back, as if testing the weight of it. $5 a day? He said. "That's outrageous. I've never heard of such a thing. I'll pay them myself if I have to." The words came without a script. They didn't sound political. They sounded like something someone would say over dinner, hearing about a friend who'd been mistreated. And for the first time in nearly a year, someone outside the NASA loop said what no one else had dared. This wasn't just a delay. This was something else. Most people who saw Suni Williams on the news remembered her smile. There was something about it, calm, open, the kind that made you believe she could handle just about anything. And she could. Over the years, she'd flown across oceans, walked in space, commanded missions, and inspired young girls who'd never seen someone like her in a flight suit. But beneath that calm exterior lived a quiet history of being doubted, questioned, second-guessed. Growing up in suburban Massachusetts, Suni never lacked drive, but she often found herself needing to prove she belonged. It wasn't just about being a woman in engineering, or being of mixed heritage in spaces dominated by sameness. It was the little things. Colleagues who called her lucky instead of skilled. Teachers who assumed she'd struggle with math. News anchors who introduced her as the female astronaut, like that was her first name. She got used to brushing it off. When she couldn't brush it off, she buried it. Butch Wilmore came from another world entirely. Southern upbringing, military tradition, years flying jets off aircraft carriers before trading wings for rockets. If anyone understood the code of quiet service, it was Butch. He believed in chain of command, in rules, in the idea that the system, while flawed, would hold up if you held your part. He wasn't naive. He'd seen veterans come home and get lost in paperwork. He'd seen brothers in arms denied basic medical support because their file got stuck in the wrong inbox. But he kept showing up, kept doing the work, because that's how you protected the next person coming through the door. For both of them, NASA wasn't just a job, it was a calling. But even callings have limits when faced with a machine too big to care. The federal employment system wasn't built for nuance. It ran on designations, on checkboxes, on policies written in some room decades ago by people who never left the ground. And once a mission was labeled temporary, permanent, experimental, that label shaped everything. Salaries, benefits, recognition. For Wilmore and Williams, the mission they flew was logged as temporary field duty. That meant their pay remained stagnant. No overtime for extended stays. No hazard bonuses for malfunctioning equipment. No additional support for emotional strain or physical exhaustion. Just $5 a day and the knowledge that they were still considered short-term visitors in a long-term situation. Publicly, NASA assured everyone there was no crisis. The astronauts could return at any time. They said everything was under control, but internally, a very different conversation was happening. Memos circulated about staffing gaps. Engineers debated whether pulling the 2 astronauts out would leave the station shorthanded. Replacement crews were months behind schedule. There was talk of optics, how it would look to admit that the return system wasn't ready. That the Starliner might need to be grounded. So instead of addressing the issue head-on, the agency let the silence stretch. Back in orbit, Suni and Butch adjusted. They always did. They took on extra duties, monitored systems, mentored newer crew members who rotated through. They didn't complain. Complaining took energy better spent on survival. Still, it wore on them, not just the extra work, but the knowledge that nobody seemed to notice. Or worse, that those who noticed didn't think it mattered. It wasn't until the president's comment, unscripted, maybe even impulsive, that people started to listen. That moment lit a match. Suddenly, newsrooms scrambled for details. Talk shows debated the value of public service. Former astronauts broke their silence, calling the $5 per diem a disgrace. The contrast hit hard. Billionaires who spent 10 minutes in space were celebrated as pioneers, showered in sponsorships and spotlight. Meanwhile, two veterans spent nearly a year floating over Earth, holding the station together with wrenches and grit, and barely anyone knew their names. It wasn't about money. It rarely was. It was about what the money symbolized. Value, respect, gratitude, the things every worker, every citizen, every human hopes for after doing something hard and thankless. Back in Houston, a junior flight officer named Lena skimmed the internal memos and shook her head. She looked up from her screen and whispered to herself, "This isn't how we're supposed to treat our own." And somewhere, far above the blue planet, Suni floated near the observation window, staring down at a world where systems always came first. She wasn't angry. She was just tired of being invisible. At first, it sounded manageable. The voice from Mission Control came through the headset with practiced calm. "A slight hiccup," they said. "A minor recalibration needed on the Starliner's return systems. Nothing to worry about. Just a few more days up there. Commander Wilmore, we appreciate your patience." But Butch Wilmore had been around long enough to recognize a deflection when he heard one. Delays were part of the game. But this wasn't just a delay. It was a red flag wrapped in polite language. Suni Williams didn't say anything right away, but her face tightened the way it always did when something didn't add up. She reviewed the checklist again, then checked the telemetry for the third time in 2 hours. Everything on their end read green. The fault wasn't on the station. It was in the return vehicle. And it wasn't small. What started as a short mission had now slipped past the 3-month mark. Then 4. By the time they crossed day 100, there was no more talk of just a few more days. That phrase vanished like an old sticker peeled off a locker, quietly. Without ceremony. The mission, unofficially, had changed. They weren't guests anymore. They were residents. But here's where it got tricky. Officially, their classification didn't budge. They remained on temporary assignment. That detail might have seemed minor to someone in administration. But to those actually doing the work, it was the difference between recognition and invisibility. Because their status hadn't changed. Neither did their benefits. There were no adjustments to hazard pay. No reclassification bonuses. No extended medical coverage. No psychological evaluation requirements. And worst of all, no correction to the $5 daily per diem that had quietly followed them up from Earth and settled like a shadow in their digital files. Back home, families kept asking when they'd be back. The answer was always vague. Soon, NASA told them, "They're doing great. Everything's going smoothly." Reporters who had covered the launch had long moved on. There were other stories now. Election chatter, economic concerns, celebrity scandals, space missions, and less dramatic or deadly, rarely stayed in the spotlight. Quiet, ongoing sacrifice didn't make for good ratings. Inside NASA, engineers knew the truth. The Starliner had suffered a cascade of issues. Some related to its software interface, others to its onboard guidance systems. Multiple test scenarios failed in simulation. The margin for error was too high. A premature return could jeopardize not just the two astronauts but the agency's relationship with its commercial partners and international allies. So decisions were made, quietly, cautiously, no formal memos, no grand announcements, just a growing understanding that Butch and Suni would remain where they were, for the good of the mission. And somewhere, between the silence and the spin, a trap took shape. No one said it on purpose. No one sent an email saying, "Let's underpay the astronauts and leave them there." But that's the thing about bureaucratic traps. They build themselves. One missed update, one unchecked box, one assumption that someone else will fix it. And suddenly, two highly trained professionals were working day after day in orbit, eating freeze-dried food and repairing thermal regulators, while making less in daily allowances than a teenager bussing tables on Earth. The astronauts didn't protest. They weren't wired that way. But silence wasn't the same as consent. By day 200, Suni had stopped counting. It didn't serve her anymore. She focused on tasks, ran her routines, kept her crew grounded with humor and stability. But inside, something had shifted. She started journaling late at night, floating in the observation bay, staring down at the curve of Earth and writing small notes to herself. Still here, still useful, still unseen. Butch stayed busy too. He doubled down on maintenance, volunteered for extra lab duties, recorded video tutorials for new crew members arriving months behind schedule. If anything, he became more dependable. But there were quiet moments, when the station dimmed for sleep mode, when voices faded and the hum of machinery took over, when he'd float near the capsule that was supposed to bring them home and just stare at it, waiting for answers it never gave. Back in Washington, emails flew between departments. Legal advisors debated whether changing the astronaut's status would set precedent. Budget officers hesitated to authorize new payments. Communications staff avoided the word stranded, like it might ignite a fire. But the fire had already started. They just didn't see it yet. Because when honor is used as a reason to ignore someone's humanity, and when duty becomes the excuse for delay, what you've built isn't a mission. It's a cage. And though it wasn't built with bad intentions, it had doors that didn't open, rules that didn't bend, and two people caught in the middle with no key in sight. The White House press room had seen its share of tense exchanges and calculated answers. But this time, it was different. There wasn't any tension in the air, at least not at first. The mood felt routine, the kind of midweek press briefing where half the reporters scrolled through their phones, and the other half tried to frame their questions just right to catch a soundbite. Then Emily Shaw from Fox News, a sharp reporter known for slipping facts into questions like hooks into quiet water, raised her hand. "Mr. President," she asked, "are you aware that 2 NASA astronauts have been on the International Space Station for almost a year and are receiving only $5 a day in per diem?" The room changed in an instant. Pens stopped moving. Keyboards went quiet. Every head turned to look at the president, Donald Trump, who had just been answering a question about trade tariffs, furrowed his brow and leaned forward slightly. $5 a day? He repeated. He looked at the press secretary, then back at Emily. "Is that true?" There was a brief shuffle of papers. Someone whispered behind the scenes, and then a nod from an aide. "That's insane," the president said, his voice flat but rising with heat. "No one told me that. I'll pay them myself if I have to. Seriously, I'll cover it personally." The words weren't rehearsed. They didn't come wrapped in legalese or policy talk. They came out the way people talk when they hear something that just doesn't sit right. By the time the press conference ended, the clip had already made its rounds online. Within an hour, it was being replayed on cable news. Within 2, it was being clipped and shared across social media like a spark catching dry grass. For some, it was easy to call it theater, political grandstanding, another headline in a week full of them. But that wasn't the response that stuck. The comments rolling in weren't just from political pundits or talking heads. They were from veterans who remembered Butch's name from his Navy days, From schoolteachers who had invited Suni to speak via livestream years earlier. From blue-collar families who didn't know much about spacecrafts but knew when someone was getting a raw deal. One tweet read, $5 a day? My grandson makes more delivering pizza. Another said, these people floated over the planet for a year, kept that thing running, and we gave them less than a gas card. A grandmother in Ohio recorded a Facebook video that went viral, holding a printed-out photo of Suni. She said, this woman flew higher than most men ever dream, and they're paying her like she's folding napkins. That ain't right. Soon, it wasn't just online chatter. Local radio hosts began reading excerpts from NASA documents. Morning news anchors invited retired astronauts to comment. A Vietnam vet called into a talk show and said, you don't leave your people in the field, and you sure as hell don't shortchange them while they're out there. Inside NASA's Public Affairs Office, the phones rang more than usual. Journalists wanted statements. Congressional staff requested clarification. Public relations advisors drafted bullet points with phrases like, standard protocol, classification status, and, within current guidelines. But none of that mattered to the people hearing the story. The number, $5, had already etched itself into their minds. It wasn't just a figure. It was a symbol of everything people feared about bureaucracy swallowing humanity. And perhaps most strikingly, neither astronaut had asked for help. There were no open letters, no live-streamed complaints, no quiet leaks to journalists. Just continued duty, just more reports filed, more repairs completed, more mentoring offered to younger crew members. That silence, the kind earned from decades of discipline and humility, made the situation sting even more. It told the public that Butch and Suni had endured it without expecting applause or rescue. And that, somehow, made people care more. Back on the ISS, Suni floated beside the viewport as Earth rolled by beneath her. The stars were clear tonight, bright and steady. She hadn't heard the press conference, but by then, she'd already sensed the shift. The tone in the daily messages had changed. There were more check-ins, more questions about comfort, even a note from a flight director that read, we're working on a solution. Butch didn't say much about it either, but later that evening, as he reviewed a systems log, he muttered under his breath, $5 a day, huh? Suni looked up from across the module. She cracked a faint smile and said, guess that's one way to make headlines. They didn't need a spotlight. But for once, the spotlight had found them. Not because they shouted, but because they didn't. And sometimes, that kind of silence says everything. The clip of the president's statement had barely cooled before it was everywhere. Morning shows led with it. Late-night hosts joked about it. But somewhere between the sound bites and the headlines, something deeper started to stir. It didn't take long for social media to erupt. Posts with the words $5 a day multiplied by the hour. Some were sarcastic, others were outraged, many were simply confused. A few users posted side-by-side photos. Astronauts floating in zero gravity next to gas station receipts. One said, fueling your car, $65. Keeping the space station running, $5. But as the noise grew louder, the tone began to shift. Beneath the memes and commentary, people started to reflect. Something about the number struck a nerve. It felt personal in a way most political stories didn't. People could argue about taxes and elections. But this was different. This was about two Americans, working in a place most of us will never reach, being treated like an afterthought. Local radio stations began opening their phone lines. A teacher in Iowa called in to say she'd used Suni's mission to inspire her 5th grade class. A retired Navy mechanic from Georgia said he remembered Butch from his early days flying out of Pensacola. He was the kind of guy who didn't say much. The caller said, but when he did, you listened. Veteran astronauts started to weigh in, too. Some of them hadn't spoken publicly in years. Now, they were writing op-eds, calling into news segments, speaking at universities. One article, published in a major Sunday paper, simply read, "It's not about the money. It's about what that money says." Internationally, the story traveled fast. A European astronaut tweeted, "In the ESA, extended missions come with full compensation, psychological support, and recognition. Our American friends deserve at least that." Canadian space officials echoed similar sentiments. One publication asked bluntly, "Is this how the world's most advanced space agency treats its own?" At NASA, the walls that had long kept emotion at bay began to crack. Within the halls of the headquarters building in D.C., email threads multiplied. Some were panicked, others were cautious, a few tried to stay neutral. One internal message read, "Do we reclassify the mission now, or wait for the review?" Another asked, "What happens if Congress opens a hearing?" A third simply said, "Has anyone spoken to Sooni or Butch about how they're handling the coverage?" It wasn't just the upper levels feeling the heat. Mission support teams in Houston started getting emails from relatives, questions from interns, even comments from janitorial staff. In the break rooms, the talk wasn't about engine specs or launch windows anymore. It was about respect. Over on Capitol Hill, a small group of aides huddled in the office of Representative Carla Martinez, a former Air Force colonel with a soft spot for space. She slammed a printed article on her desk and said, "We're sending billion-dollar payloads into orbit, but we can't bump their daily rate above a Big Mac combo?" Drafts of a new bill began circulating, aimed at reworking astronaut compensation standards. But opposition surfaced quickly. Budget hawks argued that changing one classification could set a precedent that would ripple across all federal agencies. Others worried about the optics of retroactive payments. One senator scoffed, "We're going to rewrite payroll because of a tweet?" Still, the movement gained ground. Polls showed overwhelming public support for reform. Editorials called the issue a moral failure hiding in plain sight. Union leaders from other federal departments chimed in, warning that if this could happen to astronauts, it could happen to anyone. Meanwhile, Sooni and Butch kept working. They responded to messages from flight control, completed maintenance logs, adjusted solar arrays. Their workload hadn't changed, but the energy coming up from Earth felt different. In one private message, a mission coordinator wrote, "We're hearing a lot down here. Just wanted you both to know. You've got people pulling for you." Sooni typed back simply, "Appreciate the note. We're staying focused." But that night, after lights dimmed aboard the ISS, she floated near the small porthole by her bunk and stared at the deep, endless black beyond it. She thought about her father, who used to say, "You never realize how invisible someone is until the world finally sees them." And now, the world was starting to see. By the end of the week, the tide had turned from curiosity to scrutiny. What had started as a viral clip and a few hashtags had now bloomed into a full-blown national conversation. News anchors weren't just quoting the president anymore. They were asking hard questions. Why were two astronauts, with spotless records and decades of service, stuck in space for nearly a year with no meaningful change to their status? Support, or recognition? NASA knew it couldn't stay quiet. A press conference was quickly arranged, the kind where suits gather in front of blue curtains and read from carefully worded statements. It was streamed live from Washington, and though it lasted less than 20 minutes, its tone was unmistakable. A senior spokesperson stepped up to the podium and delivered the line with perfect neutrality, "Commander Wilmore and Captain Williams were never stranded. Their extended assignment aboard the ISS was operationally necessary and fully within planned contingency protocols." There was no apology, no mention of the $5 per diem. When a reporter pressed for clarification about pay or reclassification, the response was as cold as it was vague. All personnel were compensated according to standard federal guidelines based on mission status. Translated, "We followed the rules. End of story." But it wasn't the end. Not for the public, not for the press, and not for the people inside the agency who had quietly grown tired of watching the cracks in the system widen while the official line stayed the same. Inside NASA, the mood began to shift. Privately, some staffers admitted they'd felt uneasy for months. Engineers on the Starliner team whispered in break rooms. Flight surgeons exchanged texts wondering how long the astronauts had been flagged as temporary duty in the internal systems. A young operations analyst named Jared found himself staring at a reimbursement table late one night, wondering if anyone else had noticed what he had. It turned out, more than a few had. Within days, leaks began to surface. A former mission scheduler sent a copy of a flagged internal memo to a space policy blogger. The memo, dated 8 months prior, clearly outlined the risk of leaving Wilmore and Williams in short-term status beyond the 90-day limit. It noted that reclassification would trigger tiered benefits increases, including hazard compensation and long-term health coverage. The recommended action? Defer reclassification until further review of budgetary impact. Other documents followed. Chat logs from internal communications systems showed back and forths between senior staff debating how to justify keeping the astronauts in limbo. One message read, "If we reclassify now, will ask why we waited so long. Better to hold and spin it as part of the test." Spin it. That word, more than any other, became a spark. Suddenly, people who had stayed silent for months were sending emails to journalists. A mission director, speaking on background, said, "We were told not to call it stuck. But that's what it was. The vehicle wasn't ready, and they were buying time." NASA's leadership scrambled. A memo circulated advising employees not to speak to media without prior clearance. Team leads were instructed to maintain unified language around the extended mission. Staff town halls were scheduled, then quietly postponed. HR sent reminders about confidentiality clauses. But the information had already escaped. And then, in a press roundtable 2 days later, a former agency administrator went on the record. "When I hear people inside NASA blaming the president for oversimplifying this situation," she said, "I have to ask, what exactly is so complex about treating your astronauts with dignity?" The quote was played on national radio. It was printed in weekend editorials. And with that, the wall cracked further. More journalists turned their attention to Boeing's role. Was the spacecraft truly ready when it launched? Why were early safety flags never made public? Had there been pressure to meet a deadline over ensuring redundancy? NASA, feeling the burn from all sides, began to distance itself from the contractor. Subtly but steadily, Boeing's spokesperson issued a brief statement citing full cooperation with NASA's ongoing evaluation and declined further comment. The agency's once proud image was now under the microscope, not because of a disaster, but because of how quietly and systematically it had allowed two of its finest to fall through the cracks. Meanwhile, the astronauts themselves remained silent. Back aboard the ISS, Butch reviewed diagnostics in silence. He had read the reports, heard the chatter filtering up through encrypted channels. Suni sat nearby, sorting tools in a supply locker, her hands steady but her mind elsewhere. "We're not stranded," she finally said, her voice calm. Butch looked up, waiting. "We're suspended," she added, "between doing our job and becoming the reason people start asking questions again." They both knew that the real weight wasn't in the miles between them and home. It was in the way the people they served had started to look the other way. The first real crack didn't come from a headline or a lawsuit. It came from a quiet comment on an internal NASA message board, written by someone who didn't sign their name. "They worked harder than anyone I know. They deserved better. We all do." It was short, no caps, no hashtags, just plain truth. And someone, probably an intern or junior comms staffer, took a screenshot and shared it anonymously on social media. Within hours, It had been shared tens of thousands of times. People started asking, who wrote this? But no one needed to know. The message carried itself. Inside NASA, things began to stir. At first, just whispers. A flight controller in Houston who stopped pretending the issue was complicated. A project lead who emailed her boss asking, why didn't we speak up earlier? Then came the letters. Not angry ones, honest ones. Thoughtful, respectful, and firm. Groups of engineers, techs, even mission schedulers began circulating open statements calling for review, reform, and accountability. Some didn't send letters. They just stopped staying silent. A former mission control supervisor, now retired, agreed to an interview with a local TV station. She wore her old badge on her lapel and said, "We trained them to serve. We didn't train them to be sacrificed." That same night, a well-known astronaut who had orbited Earth 3 times in the 90s posted a video from his backyard. Gray hair, soft voice, looking straight into the camera. It's not about $5. It's about the cost of being forgotten. By then, the momentum had moved beyond NASA. A few aides on Capitol Hill had already been watching the coverage closely. One of them, Anthony Brandt, a former Air Force satellite tech turned policy staffer, walked into his supervisor's office with a proposal in hand. "We need a review of astronaut compensation," he said, "and we can't wait for a tragedy to do it." At first, there was resistance. Nobody wanted to politicize space. But then something rare happened. A Republican senator from Kansas and a Democratic congresswoman from Oregon found themselves saying the same thing at the same time. This isn't a left or right issue. This is a right and wrong issue. And so, a quiet coalition took shape. They called it Justice for Space Workers. No big logos, no splashy press releases, just a group of lawmakers who saw something broken and decided to fix it. Back in Florida, as media waited for the crew's return, SUNY and Butch finally touched down. The re-entry was smooth, if delayed. The landing quiet. The sun was just beginning to rise when the capsule bobbed gently in the Atlantic, waiting to be hoisted aboard. They were greeted not with speeches, but with handshakes, a few quick health checks, a flight back to Houston. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it was over. For now. A few days later, SUNY made her first public remarks during a small event at a high school gymnasium. She stood behind a metal podium, wearing a simple jacket and slacks, her voice steady. "We were not victims," she said. "We were professionals doing our duty. But we need to ask ourselves why duty so often comes at the cost of dignity." No finger-pointing, no dramatic language, just truth. And that truth hit harder than any headline. Butch spoke a week later at a Veterans Outreach event. The crowd was smaller, but the moment was just as powerful. "This isn't about money," he said, pacing slowly across the stage. "It's about what we value. We put our lives on the line for this country. What do we get in return? $5. Not $5 in cash. $5 in recognition. $5 in care." The applause wasn't thunderous. It was measured. People nodded. Some wiped away tears, not because they felt sorry for him, but because he had said something they had carried for years but never put into words. Across the country, more voices joined the call. Former astronauts, schoolteachers, policy wonks. A nurse in St. Louis posted a TikTok video comparing hazard pay in hospitals to that of space missions, ending with the line, "Do better, America." The message was spreading, not just as a moment, but as a movement. And movements don't always start with chants or signs. Sometimes they start with silence and grow from courage. It started like any other hearing. Fluorescent lights hummed, suits shuffled into chairs, water glasses clinked, but there was a quiet buzz in the air that nobody could quite name, a kind of hush before a storm. The House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology had convened a special session. And this time, the world was watching. The name of the hearing was clinical enough. Review of Astronaut Mission Classification and Compensation Standards. But for millions tuning in, it had a simpler name: The Showdown. Reporters filled the gallery. Cameras rolled from every corner. On the dais, lawmakers of both parties adjusted their microphones, reviewing notes, trying to look impartial. But everyone knew this wasn't just about policy anymore. Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore sat side by side at the witness table. No uniforms, no medals, just quiet presence. Their names were placarded in bold letters in front of them. But they didn't need signs to be recognized. Their faces had become familiar across the country. NASA sent Deputy Administrator Harold Langston, a polished man with decades of agency experience and the kind of practiced tone that made everything sound stable. Even when it wasn't, his opening remarks were textbook. Our astronauts were not stranded. Their presence aboard the International Space Station was essential to operations. Compensation followed standard federal guidelines for temporary assignments. Any narrative implying negligence is both unfair and inaccurate. The committee chair, Representative Carla Martinez, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She turned the floor over to Butch Wilmore. Butch didn't clear his throat or shuffle his papers. He simply looked ahead, met the eyes of the committee members, and spoke in the kind of voice that people lean into rather than talk over. "We didn't feel stranded because we trusted the mission," he said. "We didn't speak out because we believed in the chain of command. But that trust should go both ways. We gave our best. All we ask is that the system doesn't forget that." Silence. Then Suni leaned forward, her hands folded, her expression calm. "Respect isn't a policy," she said. "It's a culture. And ours needs to change. Not just for us, for the people who come next. The students watching this, the young engineers just starting out, the quiet workers in labs and control rooms who never make headlines but hold the whole thing together." A murmur passed through the audience. Then applause. Lawmakers nodded. Even those who'd come in skeptical sat back, visibly moved. The testimony wasn't fiery, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real, honest, and that's what cut through the noise. And then, unexpectedly, the chair turned toward the gallery and said, "We've been informed that President Trump is in attendance. If he wishes to address the committee, we will allow a brief statement." The room shifted. Everyone turned. From the second row, Donald Trump stood, buttoned his coat, and walked to the center aisle. No fanfare, no cameras flashing, just a former businessman turned president standing in a hearing room full of engineers and lawmakers. "I wasn't invited here," he began, "but I'm here anyway, because when I offered to pay these astronauts out of my own pocket, it wasn't about politics. It was about doing the right thing when the system forgets how to." He paused. "Let it land. We can argue numbers all day. But the truth is, they flew higher than anyone in this room. And we gave them $5. That's not oversight. That's neglect. And it doesn't matter who's in charge, if we can't fix that. We're not worth the stars on our flag." Then, with a slight nod toward Suni and Butch, he returned to his seat. The room held its breath. And then, it shifted again. Not into chaos, not into argument, into clarity. Suddenly, it wasn't about Trump, or Langston, or even Congress. It was about two people who had given everything they had to a system that had quietly lost its sense of gratitude. And how that system had finally been forced to look in the mirror. After the hearing ended, reporters swarmed the steps outside. TV anchors dissected every word. Analysts debated policy paths, but most people watching from home weren't listening to the pundits. They were thinking about trust and dignity, and how easily those things could be lost if no one bothered to speak up. Inside the Capitol, as the crowd dispersed and staffers collected notes, Representative Martinez sat alone for a moment at the dais. She looked down at the empty witness table and said softly, "Sometimes it takes silence to wake the country up." And for the first time in months, The tide began to turn, not because someone shouted louder, but because someone finally listened. The hearing may have ended, but its echo hadn't faded. It lingered, on airwaves, in living rooms, across late-night monologues, and in quiet corners of the internet where policy analysts and watchdog journalists sharpened their focus. It took less than 72 hours for the first crack to widen. A major investigative outlet released a bombshell report titled The Mission Files. It was dense but devastating, pulled from a mix of leaked emails, internal directives, and scheduling logs. It painted a picture that went far beyond simple oversight. According to the report, NASA leadership had known about critical software faults in the Starliner as early as week 3 of the mission. Engineers had flagged recurring guidance glitches and systems instability. One email, dated just 16 days into the astronauts' arrival at the ISS, read, "If we push return too early, we're risking catastrophic failure. We need time." But perhaps more troubling than the technical delays was what came next. The mission, despite clearly stretching past every expected milestone of a short-term assignment, was never reclassified. That single administrative decision, one box left unchecked, meant no change in per diem, no recalculated hazard compensation, no extra psychological health measures. Why? Multiple documents revealed the same term over and over: budgetary optics. One internal communication from a deputy administrator read, "If we reclassify, we invite scrutiny. Easier to keep the mission in limbo until return." Another note, from a senior policy advisor to the agency's financial director, stated plainly, "The astronauts will adapt. They've been trained to. Better to deal with fallout later than risk PR damage now." But the fallout was already here. Headlines spread like wildfire. NASA chose image over integrity. 2 astronauts, 1 broken system, $5 a day. The cost of silence in space. Public trust, once unshakable, began to shift, not because people didn't still admire NASA's mission, but because they now saw the cracks in the machinery behind it. Respect for the astronauts only deepened, but respect for the system that managed them? That began to crumble. Within days, the current NASA administrator was called to a private session at the White House. Attending were senior lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, a select group of scientists, and President Trump himself. Details of the conversation weren't made public, but insiders reported that the tone was direct. The president, sources said, did not mince words. "If we can't take care of our heroes in space," he reportedly told the room, "what kind of country are we trying to be?" The morning after that meeting, a memo went out to all NASA staff announcing the upcoming retirement of 2 senior administrators. It was framed as a planned transition, but nobody missed the subtext. Quiet resignations followed. The tide had turned. Meanwhile, offers poured in for Butch and Suni. Book deals, speaking tours, endorsements. Major networks competed for exclusive interviews. But neither astronaut seemed interested. Instead, they returned to something simpler. Suni visited public schools in Boston and Denver, speaking to students about integrity, teamwork, and how to hold your values when no one is watching. She brought photos from the ISS, passed around her old flight suit, and told kids not to chase attention, but purpose. Butch returned to Tennessee and led weekend seminars at a local veterans center. He sat with young recruits, taught them about aviation and responsibility, and finished each talk by saying, "Don't wait for someone else to do the right thing. Sometimes it starts with you." They didn't speak about pay, or betrayal, or headlines. They didn't need to. Their actions said enough, and the country noticed. They began to appear in murals, in classroom posters, in State of the Union addresses. Journalists wrote editorials calling them the conscience of a system that had lost its compass. They hadn't fought for fame. They hadn't shouted. They had just shown up, done the work, endured, And when the truth finally came out, it became undeniable that it wasn't their voices that failed. It was the system that had refused to listen until it was too late. But now, the system had nowhere left to hide. It didn't happen overnight. The system, as always, moved slowly, grudgingly, but it moved, following the release of damning investigations and the public outcry that followed. Congress convened once more, this time, not to ask questions but to take action. Across party lines, a rare consensus formed. The Astronaut Dignity and Duty Act was drafted, reviewed, revised, and passed in record time. It wasn't a sweeping overhaul, but it was precise and deeply symbolic. The bill raised per diem rates across all mission durations, included retroactive compensation for long-term deployments, and restructured how federal space mission classifications were reviewed. No longer would astronauts be left floating in a gray zone of duty without clear recognition of sacrifice. The language of the bill was careful, but firm. The message was louder than the legalese. We see you now. We understand. When the final vote passed, the chamber didn't erupt. There was no confetti, no handshakes on camera, just a quiet nod from those who knew how rare it was for dignity to win in legislation. Weeks later, an Oval Office ceremony was arranged. The tone was unlike others. No parade of officials, no cameras flashing wildly, just two astronauts, a president, and a handful of invited guests, family members, schoolteachers, and space program veterans. President Trump stood behind the lectern, the newly minted Presidential Medal of Duty in his hands. It was simple, silver and blue, engraved with the ISS outline and the phrase, service, sacrifice, strength. They never asked for anything. The president said, his voice steady, and that's why they deserve everything. He turned first to Butch Wilmore. Butch stepped forward, took a breath, and leaned in to speak softly so only the president and those nearby could hear. I appreciate it, he said, but I'd like this medal to carry someone else's name. Give it to a kid studying the stars who never made it home. There was a pause, and then a nod. Next, Suni stepped forward. She accepted the medal quietly, her smile tight but genuine. When handed the accompanying check meant as an honorarium, she glanced down once, then handed it back. I know a nonprofit working with girls in STEM, she said. They need it more than I do. And that was it. No fanfare, no applause, just the weight of gratitude hanging in the air. Back at NASA, changes had already begun. Internal policy review committees were formed with actual teeth, not just rubber stamps. An anonymous staff feedback channel was launched, and for the first time, it was flooded, not with complaints, but with ideas. A junior engineer named Alina, only 6 months into her role, was asked to join one of the ethics review boards. She'd never imagined someone would want to hear her voice at that level. But now, they did. More than anything, a new tone settled across the agency. You could hear it in the way supervisors spoke during mission briefings. You could feel it in the way younger staffers asked questions without fear of sounding critical. You could see it in the break room bulletin boards, now full of suggestions, messages of appreciation, and, taped to the center, a black and white photo of Suni and Butch floating side by side in the ISS. In classrooms, teachers used the story not just to talk about space travel, but about resilience, ethics, and how change doesn't always come from raising your voice, but from refusing to lower your values. A high schooler in Oklahoma wrote an essay titled, $5 and a Legacy, ending with the line, "They didn't ask for justice. They made us ask why we hadn't given it sooner." That was the real victory. It wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came like a tide that quietly reshapes the shore. Subtle but unstoppable. 2 people were pushed into a system that forgot them. They didn't break. They didn't bend. They didn't lash out. They stood tall, did their jobs, held onto their character. and waited for the world to catch up. And when it did, everything looked just a little bit clearer. It didn't feel dramatic at first. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches, but little by little, things began to change, and not just at NASA. The Astronaut Dignity and Duty Act passed into law with quiet dignity. But its influence reached far beyond mission control. It became the first domino. Within weeks, federal agencies across the country were asked to reevaluate how they defined extended service. Not just in space, but in forests, war zones, and consulates scattered across unstable parts of the world. Firefighters working month-long wildland deployments. Diplomats living under constant threat in embassies. First responders assigned to national disaster zones for months on end. All of them had lived under vague rules. Temporary assignments stretched indefinitely, with little recognition for what was lost along the way. Now, that tide began to turn. One memo from the Office of Personnel Management summed it up best. Duty is not diminished by distance. Sacrifice is not measured in hours. Compensation should follow service, not convenience. Inside NASA, the culture shifted in real time. It started with a single poster hung in the Houston Mission Control hallway. It read, "People first, not just protocols," printed in bold black letters against a white backdrop. It wasn't flashy, but it stuck. That slogan became a quiet mission statement. A new internal ethics policy was adopted. Mission planning now required mental health check-ins, real-time family communication access, and mandatory post-mission recovery support. Psychological welfare wasn't considered an afterthought. It became part of the flight plan. And something else happened. The younger generation, the engineers, analysts, and mission planners who had once whispered doubts in break rooms, found their voices. They joined task forces. They spoke up in strategy meetings. They used their names, not anonymous notes. Even the leadership started listening. At Boeing, the Starliner program was placed under new oversight. No longer just procedural audits. This time, astronauts themselves sat on the review boards, alongside ethicists and mission safety advocates from outside the agency. Real accountability, not to maintain appearances, but to prevent repeat failures. One senior aerospace engineer put it this way in a televised interview: "For too long, safety was a checkbox. Now, it's a responsibility with faces." Public perception of astronauts shifted. Too, they were no longer seen as distant figures in gleaming suits. Floating above it all, they became something more grounded. Guardians of science and service. Resilient not because they were flawless, but because they kept going in silence. Without reward, schools updated their STEM curriculums to include case studies from the Wilmore Williams mission. Leadership programs cited the story as an example of how quiet endurance could create loud change. Even news anchors who once led with flashy space launch clips now began ending their broadcasts with quotes about ethics in public service. As for the two astronauts themselves, Suni Williams continued her outreach in STEM, but now her message carried more weight. She began guest lecturing at universities, not about engineering, but about ethical leadership. Her message was consistent. You don't measure success by medals. You measure it by whether you left the place better than you found it. She helped launch a nonprofit focused on mentoring girls of color in aerospace careers, making sure no one who dreamed of the stars ever had to feel invisible. Butch Wilmore took a different path. He partnered with veteran advocacy groups and medical research institutions, quietly championing expanded access to post-mission care. His focus was simple: ensure future astronauts didn't suffer in silence from burnout, PTSD, or long-term injury with no one to call. He began writing policy drafts, sitting in committee rooms, meeting with lawmakers behind closed doors. No cameras, no microphones, just a quiet man with a quiet mission: dignity for those who serve. The government, long hesitant to define space service as anything more than symbolic, finally changed its tune. New directives from the Department of Defense and Homeland Security formally recognized extended space deployment as high-intensity service, opening doors to long-term benefits and national honors. They began awarding service medals retroactively to astronauts from earlier eras who had endured similar silent sacrifices, those who had never spoken up, but paved the way just the same. And with all of this, something even deeper shifted. The culture of silence broke, not just around money or policy, but around expectation, around the myth that to serve well, one must suffer quietly. That dignity could only be earned by enduring indignity. No more. A senior official at NASA, speaking at an annual ethics summit, said it best: "We once taught our people to endure. Now, we teach them to speak." And though headlines moved on, and newer missions captured the public's attention, one truth remained fixed: the system could never go back. Not to the quiet dehumanization of unacknowledged labor. Not to the comfortable excuse of standard procedure. Not to the silence that once covered neglect with pride. That chapter had closed. A new one had begun. The wind at the Kennedy Space Center that morning was soft, brushing past the palms as if the earth itself wanted to whisper something gentle. There was no grand parade, no orchestras or news vans, just rows of folding chairs set up near Launch Pad 39A, where so many journeys had begun. This time, the gathering wasn't for a launch. It was for something quieter. A thank you, a reckoning, a kind of healing. On a simple stone pedestal beside the walkway leading to the launch tower, a new plaque had been installed, bronze, unpolished, with only one sentence etched across it: "In honor of those who served with dignity, and reminded us what it means to be human." People stopped and stared, not because it sparkled, but because it didn't. It sat there without begging attention, like the kind of truth that doesn't need to shout. Suni Williams stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching a group of elementary school kids tug on their teacher's sleeves. Pointing at the plaque, one little girl, maybe 8, asked, "Did she really go to space?" The teacher nodded. Suni knelt beside her and said, "Twice, but coming back was harder." The child blinked, unsure what that meant, and Suni just smiled. Some lessons don't need to be taught all at once. Butch Wilmore was nearby, helping his grandson balance a toy shuttle on the grass. He didn't talk about the hearings, or the policy changes. He just laughed when the model tipped over and said, "Try again. That's what flying really is." The crowd that gathered was small: families, a few NASA staffers, some retired mission specialists, and students from a local space camp. The kind of people who show up not for headlines, but for heart. Unexpectedly, President Trump arrived with no announcement, no media entourage, just a plain suit and a small security detail. He walked the length of the lawn slowly, paused at the plaque, then turned to the small audience and said, "Some victories happen without noise, but they echo the longest." That was all. No speech, no ceremony. Just a nod toward the two astronauts. And then he sat down in the back row beside an elderly couple who didn't even recognize him until after the event ended. As the afternoon sun tilted west, a final message was projected onto a nearby screen. It wasn't delivered live. It had been recorded quietly, in Suni's own voice, against a backdrop of starfields. Never underestimate the power of doing the right thing, even if no one's watching. Her voice didn't crack, but for many listening, their hearts did. Then came a soft video montage. No narration, just images. Technicians aboard the ISS installing upgraded sleep pods, each with nameplates for the current crew. NASA interns in a training room, watching old hearing footage, taking notes not just on science, but on integrity. A shot of Butch visiting a rehab center for veterans, handing out flight logs and just sitting, listening. Suni in a classroom, helping a girl build her first paper model of a lunar lander. And finally, Families of astronauts gathered at a NASA community center, holding hands, smiling quietly as a new wall was unveiled, portraits of service members in space, past and present, with a single phrase overhead: seen, heard, honored. The screen faded to black. Then the narrator returned, not with facts, but with questions. What about you? Would you speak up when a quiet injustice unfolds around you? Would you value service over celebrity? Courage over comfort? Because sometimes, the loudest truth is spoken without volume. Sometimes, kindness builds bridges even rockets can't reach. And in a world so often chasing stars, the real heroes are the ones who bring light without asking for it. So, share this story if you believe dignity matters more than dollars. Tag someone who silently makes the world better. Be the reason someone feels seen today. Because kindness, like gravity, holds us all together. Sometimes, the biggest changes don't come from shouting or fighting. They come from standing firm in silence. With integrity, Suni and Butch didn't ask for justice. They simply lived in a way that made the rest of us question why justice wasn't already there. So here's a question for you. Have you ever stayed silent when you knew something wasn't right? What would it take for you to speak up? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if you found value in this story, make sure to subscribe to Covert Truths for more hidden stories that reveal the quiet power of doing what's right, even when no one's watching.